Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W and our discussion of the United States and the Cold War. In the previous lecture, I talked about the background and context of what grew to become the Korean War. In this lecture, I'll continue that discussion and also talk about the United States' intervention in the war. On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung and the North Koreans launched an invasion of the South. Historians have debated a lot about why the North decided to invade at that time. And there are lots of different reasons that have been postulated, and if you look at different historians, you'll see different ones. But I'll mention three here, understanding that there are many others in the background as well. For one, it seemed in that moment that Rhee was particularly vulnerable. As I discussed in the previous lecture, he had been struggling under many public protests in the South. Rhee was also growing increasingly aggressive, had sent troops near the border, and may have been planning an invasion himself. As noted in the last lecture, both sides had been sending guerrilla warriors across the border. As a second reason, Stalin, while he had certainly waffled on the issue, gave the green light for the attack and indicated that he would offer support and supplies. Stalin also saw that perhaps this invasion might help to weaken and isolate Japan. He hoped to counter the possibility of a NATO-like alliance in Asia, and so if South Korea could be removed from the equation, it would also weaken Japan. Other historians have argued that Stalin's hope was to weaken the United States and draw them into what would become a long, extended, and costly ordeal. But that's perhaps reading a little bit too much with the benefit of hindsight. It wasn't known or understood at that time that the United States would in fact intervene. After this initial invasion, the United Nations met hastily to discuss the issue and decide what was to be done next. This meeting of the United Nations, coming relatively early in the organization's history, were very important for not only what became the Korean War over the next few years, but establishing precedents that would alter the global climate for decades to come. In those meetings, the UN demanded a cessation of hostilities and the withdrawal of northern forces back north of the 38th parallel. Thus, North Korea, by these decisions, was branded as the aggressor in the conflict, even though, as I've mentioned, both sides had been launching attacks against each other. On June 27th, Truman ordered American naval and air forces into the region under the direction of Douglas MacArthur. We'll talk much more about that shortly. On the same day, the United Nations approved aid for the South Korean effort. Importantly, the Soviet Union boycotted the meeting, ostensibly because the West had not recognized Mao's government in China. But this meant that the Soviets weren't there to possibly veto the UN effort in Korea, which then passed 9-0. Over the following days, Truman conferred with members of Congress. While some were upset that he had not come to them earlier, aside from a few vocal opponents, Congress supported the war effort. Truman assured the Congress and the American people, and even sent a note to Stalin, that the United States intended only to restore the border at the 38th parallel, not to achieve an overall conquest of North Korea. As the United States and United Nations forces got mobilized, the early few weeks of the war went very badly for South Korea. Surprised by the North Korean invasion, they were essentially in retreat and overrun deep into the south. It was a vicious conflict, a total war in the south. Guerrilla warfare, massacres, tortures, executions, and rape were common. Women and children were deployed as fighters on both sides, and many civilians were killed in the conflict. American and UN troops began to arrive and establish a defensive perimeter, which eventually became solidified and known as the Pusan Perimeter, around the important port city of Pusan. This was the major port city in the southeast corner of Korea, the closest point to Japan. It had become the major point of entry and staging area for American and UN troops. So while much territory was lost in those early weeks of the war, once the American troops began pouring in, armaments and supplies coming through the port of Pusan, there was no way the North Korean forces would drive them back into the sea. While Truman said publicly that United States intentions were only to restore the 38th parallel, privately he wondered whether the United States should attempt more. He certainly used the first 6 months or so of the war to make significant changes in American policy. Here are a few of the events of the summer of 1950 and Truman's actions during that time. These included things like enacting the recommendations of NSC 68, transforming the United Nations, increasing America's commitment to Formosa and Indochina, beginning to rearm Germany, tripling American defense spending, and eventually pushing back and invading North Korea itself. So I'll mention a few of these in more detail now. First, in terms of the United Nations. The United States was concerned that the Soviets might veto their efforts in Korea, and overall concerned that the Soviet veto could become increasingly powerful in heading off American and other international initiatives. So the United States spearheaded an effort to remove final decision-making powers from the United Nations Security Council and moving it to the United Nations General Assembly. There, no nation had veto power, and nations like Costa Rica, for instance, had voting power equal to the United States and the Soviet Union. Of course, this action weakened the United States' influence in the United Nations as well, but it was a calculated gamble. At the time, the United States controlled a great majority of votes in the United Nations and simply wanted to circumvent the Soviet veto power. The gamble paid off in the short term, but as the decades went by, the United States at times would regret this move. Next, the United States positioned the 7th Fleet in the waters between Korea and Formosa, also known as Taiwan, where Chiang's provisional government was located. While Truman had been reluctant to support Chiang after his defeat to Mao, he now feared that the Korean conflict would give China a new excuse to invade Formosa, and so he sent additional aid. Third, this is also the period in which the United States began to aid the efforts of the French to maintain their hold on Indochina, notably Vietnam. And, of course, we'll talk much more about this later in the course. And fourth, the United States launched a plan to rearm Germany, although France and Britain were somewhat horrified at this prospect. Dean Acheson and Truman believed that a renewed Germany was the key to stability in Europe and could provide a counterbalance to the Soviet Union on that front. Negotiations were delicate, and the final resolution called for only a minimal rebuilding of the German military. The United States largely paid for the military equipment, was required to increase aid to other European nations, and sent 4 divisions of American troops to Germany. While some congressmen objected to the much larger commitment to Europe, the action in Korea was too threatening for most to accept. The Senate approved the restructuring by 69 to 21. In the meantime, collectively, these actions gave Truman and Dean Acheson more confidence in dealing with Korea, an issue I'll discuss further in the next lecture.